afternoon, everyone. Thank you for sticking around with us, and I hope that you enjoyed Michelle Mohabeer's Coolie-tudes. So we're gonna have about 27 minutes for a question and answer segment. I'll start off with the first half for about 15 minutes or 13 with some questions to Michelle. Then I'll open it up to the audience. You can type in the chat or in the question and answer segment on your Zoom. Or if you're so inclined, you can raise your hand and I can unmute you as we get later into the segment. So I'll start by turning it over to Michelle and just ask, just to give the audience who may not have read your bio or the brochure on the Tamari website, if you could just tell us how you came to developing this film. You've been doing films for decades, and I'm curious if you could just talk us through your process on this particular film, which is very clearly quite personal, and how you came to meet the subjects and develop the filmmaking technique. So Michelle, let's hear from you.
Thanks, Andrew. Coolie-tudes is really a bookend to a film I made called Coconut Cane and Cutlass. That film was released in 1994. It was actually shot on location in Guyana in 1992, and in studio in Toronto. So it's a bookend because I wanted to make a queer ethnography, which is what queer Coolie-tudes is. It's a queer ethnography about those of us that live in the diaspora. I'm gonna apologize before, because I might cut in and out. My video is doing something strange. So,
sorry.
So anyhow, but hey, you don't need to watch my face as I talk. But anyhow, we're all used to this COVID situation, so we're not live. Anyhow, so yeah, so this film really came about as a bookend to Coconut Cane and Cutlass, because I wanted to create a queer ethnography of really visualize, and give voice to the histories, the personal experiences, and the context in which queer Indo-Caribbean subjects live in Canada, and also our histories as not just people that have a background, whether through indenture or slavery, because the film also deals with mixed race ancestries as well. So it also touches upon ideas of migration, how we are read in a Canadian context or even a North American context. The fact that as Indo-Caribbean people, as queer Indo-Caribbean people or mixed race queer Indo-Caribbean people, our identities are oftentimes overlooked, not visible, subsumed under this kind of normative identity, this kind of generalized identity as South Asian. And many of us don't necessarily strictly identify as South Asian, so that's the problem. And sometimes when you think about queer Caribbean identities, we're not always included in that, because also some of us don't easily fit within queer Black diasporic identities, some do. For me personally, I claim both Indo and Afro identities in the sense that racially I'm mixed race, but culturally I've always identified, and this is very strong in all of my films, culturally also with Blackness and formations of Blackness because of how I was also raised in Guyana. So this film is not simply personal, it's actually quite historical, visual, political. It very much is about me crafting an aesthetics of for instance, Douglas aesthetics. I created that in the film, but also me just really interpreting histories, context, the lives of my subjects. There are 7 subjects in the film, including myself at the start of the film, and I'm the continuity between Coconut Cane and Cutlass and this particular film. So this work is really informed, I would say, by queer ethnographies, cultural studies, film studies, visuality, etc., which is my background.
Thanks for that, Michelle. And just a note to the audience, as we get into the Q&A, that we are recording the session. So keep that in mind if you do ask a question by speaking. Thanks, Michelle. You mentioned your previous films, and I know you've been a filmmaker for across 3 decades.
Yeah, since
And I'm
1990.
sure, you've seen so many changes in the field as a woman, as a queer person, as a person of color. If you could just speak to that. I mean, 2021, we're living, as you mentioned, during this strange pandemic. How was that how have those changes affected your craft, your relationship with the industry, and your own filmmaking? I'd love to hear you speak to that.
Um, well, I have a hybrid relationship to film. First of all, I have all of my degrees are in film studies. So I come to making film through really this very scholarly background in film studies. I was always interested and steeped in film. So for me, my background in terms of how I came to make films was through having this background in film studies and cultural studies later on when I did my PhD at University of Toronto. But in terms of currently right now, I would say I don't really exist within a mainstream film industry. I exist more within an independent industry, so as an alternative to the mainstream. And I also exist as an academic and filmmaker. So I kind of occupy both worlds at this point because filmmaking is part of what I do at this point, and my films are all of them are quite theoretical, quite informed by various theories. This film really pays homage to someone I admire, Glissant, his book Poetics of Relation. So his philosophy on opacity, I touch upon in this film. It's also researched. My work definitely comes from a place of research in terms of ethnography, queer ethnography. Sorry, I think the last part of your question was how have I seen changes?
Yeah, like how has your relationship with your filmmaking changed across the years? Like you mentioned that you exist beyond the mainstream, and I'm wondering if has that relationship in independent film changed across the 90s, the early 2000s, into the 2010s? Have things become better? Have there been any
Yeah,
stagnation?
I don't know if things become better per se. I think there's always an issue in film, and it's always around funding. I think
Yeah.
funding is fundamental and crucial to our work. So I think if you want to say, I think actually when I began, I think there were certain kinds of opportunities there for women in particular. And later now, perhaps there are little bits of opportunities for women of color, people of color, or queer people of color. But I would say the funding today isn't necessarily any easier. I think it's still a struggle to get funding to make films. I mean, I don't always get funding to make films I would like to make. There's many films I wanted to make before Queer Coolie-tudes, and I didn't get the funding for based on the subject matter. So I would say this, I think something I've noticed is that unfortunately, I think it's great that funders want to fund us in terms of certain kinds of work. But the problem with that is that we are, I would say, ghettoized into making work. And I don't mean ghettoized in a pejorative way, but I think for want of a better word, I just think that our experiences then are viewed in very narrow ways, as if to say the only types of work we should make is about identity, is about themes of migration, immigration, displacement, all of those themes. Whereas some of us have many interests, and I'm actually very interested in many themes that I teach, that I read about, and the general, my feelings about the world at this point in time. So I think, in other words, we don't always want to make films simply about where we're located, who we're about, what we're from. I think it so marginalizes us in that regard. So that's what I mean by ghettoizing. I mean, we are just placed in these slots. And unfortunately, I think it's easier, in other words, to get funding for those types of projects as opposed to other more wider, even philosophical type of projects, because it seems as though those are reserved for other kinds of filmmakers, particularly men.
That's such a great response. I'll ask one follow-up before I open to the audience, but I really cannot emphasize how vital that point you just made is, which is the way that whether it's queer people or people of color, that they become filtered through their identities. Their filmmaking can just exist, and I'm sure you found that also as an academic, the kind of research that academics of color are encouraged to pursue. And I was wondering how the intersection between your academic life and your filmmaking life operate, especially on that point of the ways that whether it's as a person of color, as a woman, as a queer person, you kind of find yourself being filtered through that prism rather than just being able to do, okay, I want to do, a fun comedy, or I want to do this, instead of being asked to sort of perform your marginalization in a way.
Yeah, I think my academic work is, I actually try to connect it to what I do in terms of film. So my academic work, I mean, I teach in a wide range of areas: cultural studies, film studies, LGBTQ, gender, queer studies, etc. Visuality, performance. Those are some of the themes and areas that I teach in. Aesthetics are also really important to me. I'm currently teaching a course, political aesthetics and feminist representation. So I'm interested in that. I'm also interested in the state of the world, in the sense of what we do to the planet as people, what we do to the planet, and the damage that we have caused to this planet. And I'm very interested in that, for instance, in terms of my own explorations. And and this is why nature and landscape is also very strong and prominent in my work. But yeah, I mean, I think that for filmmakers today, I think younger filmmakers really have an onus to kind of get back to supposedly who they are in one way, to reproduce themselves and their identities, and they'll get funding for that. But if they choose to make other types of project, I'm not so sure. I mean, that's the reason why I'm working on a book right now, because I'm working on a book because I feel that there are a lot of voices that have not always been privileged in specifically where I live in Toronto, Canada. Whereas I think more male filmmakers actually have been privileged than women filmmakers. So I'm working on a book. It's a collection with many other people collaborating. And it's really about placing Canadian, diasporic, Indigenous, queer, racialized filmmakers, women filmmakers, placing them at the center of the narrative and our works, whether it's experimental or drama, documentary, etc., or hybrid work, etc. So that's a book I'm very slowly working on as I deal with teaching. But anyhow.
Well, we'll look forward to that. So we'll keep looking out for that. Does anyone from the audience have a question that they'd like to ask, whether in the chat or if you'd like to speak, I can unmute you. We've got some persons that are attending. Even if you just want to make a comment, I mean, as a Caribbean person, yes, Tanita.
Hi. Oh, hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
I'm good. How are you? I have to say, Michelle, this film resonated with me on so many different levels. With all the different people involved, there were different aspects of my life that I saw. And for myself, as being Indo-Guyanese, born in Canada, raised in America, and not coming out, I was in a long relationship with a man that turned out to be domestic violence. And so when I did come out, I was out of it, and people just felt it was, well, she's traumatized, that's why. And I also came out as non-binary. So the pandemic was really great for me in just terms of discovering myself. And it was really interesting because when they were talking about Indo-Caribbean spaces versus South Asian spaces, I tried joining different meetups because of the pandemic, and I joined the South Asian one, and they were very welcoming and open, but I could not connect with him at all. And then in terms of going into Caribbean spaces, like my first girlfriend was Jamaican, and we connected so much culturally, but she could not come to terms with me being Hindu. And so it really is this kind of this little niche space that we occupy as Indo-Caribbean people. And also for myself, I have never been accepted as Guyanese because my skin is very light. So all my life I've been called by my family Chinese. When I joined the Guyana Club at York, they told me I was lying, I'm not Guyanese. And so it's been, you know, a journey for me. And I'm older now, so it doesn't really matter to me for my family about not accepting my queerness or my gender identity. But I have an 8-year-old, and he, if you ask him, he's a boy and he's got a lot of, you know, tendencies typical of boys, but he loves nail polish and makeup. And I find that I have to protect him, not from his peers, because the other little boys, they really don't care, but from his family. And so it's quite, the fact that we were raised in Canada and we're both Canadians and we still have to negotiate this space around gender identity and gender norms set out by Indo-Caribbean patriarchy is frustrating. And I'm kind of hoping that in having this film and having the people that you've had speak in the film and this wanting for an Indo-Caribbean queer space, that we can start to move towards one in Toronto. I know in New York they have one, and they do really great things, Jahaji, and other Indo-Caribbean spaces. And it's really positive for me. I've met a lot of queer Indo-Caribbean people since coming out.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to say this film really made me happy in terms of understanding myself, knowing there are others like me, and hoping there's a positive future for young Indo-Caribbean Canadian people. So thank you.
You're welcome. That's really the reason why I made this film, because I find that in the city of Toronto where we live, I've had many involvements over the years. I've moved through many different arts, cultural, Caribbean, all kinds of communities. And I've always personally felt that I wasn't quite sure where I fit, where I belong. So that whole notion of belonging. And I most definitely do not fully or do not really identify personally as South Asian. I really was not raised in a way that could connect me to the culture. I claim it as a diasporic identity, as a broader diasporic identity, but I'm quite Caribbean. That's how I'm most comfortable identifying with, is Caribbean, mixed race, and mixed culture, because I was not raised Hindu, Muslim. I was raised Catholic. I was raised in a city. I was raised amongst all different kinds of people from different backgrounds. I was raised in terms of certain neighborhoods that could be perceived as working class. I was raised with Black people in certain neighborhoods that I lived in when I was a child. So, and I emigrated to Canada with my family when I was 12, 13, that very pivotal time, which I touch upon at the beginning of the film. So for all of those reasons and all of what you've mentioned, this is why I wanted to make the film. I know the film is doing really well in terms of academic use, because I know that it's been purchased and it's about to be purchased in different places. So I think that's a space that it could connect, because the film has theoretical aspects as well. I think it definitely has use and currency in terms of academia. As to whether it's TV friendly, because it's really not conventional. Because I want to touch on a question I suppose you had in your questions. I'm not sure if we talked about it. Why did I choose the single, I wouldn't say portraits, but the single ethnographies? Because that's how I wanted to frame the subjects. I wanted to really visualize the subjects, their lives, their histories, their identities, their struggles around their queerness, how they were accepted. I wanted to give everyone a kind of a presence. So this would have been a very different film if I just assembled everyone together and have them in conversation. That's not my style anyhow. And I was also able to craft this film artistically, aesthetically, and I carefully crafted this film around giving each single subject their own particular look, their own particular aesthetic. Whether that comes across to viewers, I'm not sure, but each particular subject has a particular aesthetic attached to them. And that's something I carefully crafted in this work. And that's me as an artist, as a filmmaker. That's how I work. So I was not interested in making a conventional, straightforward type of documentary. It has storytelling, though. It tells stories about all these subjects. So that's why I see it more as a queer ethnography, with very strong visual elements and a visuality that also tells the stories. So I mean, I thank you all for attending, those of you that attended and that might stay for this Q&A. And I would be very interested to know if there's anyone in the audience from Guyana, because I wanted to do this particular screening because can't travel there, but I want to know how you connect to the film, if there anyone from Guyana in the audience, as opposed to, the diaspora. So I think your connection to the film might be different. So I'm just curious if anyone wants to not be shy, speak, or.
Thank you for your commentary, Tanita, for sharing that. And please, anyone, Michelle is urging you. I'd love to hear from anyone in Guyana, even if you just want to put a comment in the chat or speak. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the film and your relationship with it as somebody that is in Guyana rather than in diaspora.
Mm-hmm.
As we, yeah, I'm gonna ask another question. We have just about 5 minutes left. I'll see if any last question pops up in the meantime. But listening to your previous response, Michelle, as someone who's been in the industry for a bit, and one aspect of the film that really resonated with me was the older queer generation started speaking through their experiences. And in the quick Q&A yesterday with the short film Queer Block, we were talking about ageism in the queer community, and how very often stories from older queer persons are very often erased from the media. And I really appreciated the way that, for me, the stories I found most touching in Queer Coolie-tudes were the older generation speaking through that development. So I'd love to hear you speak as somebody, especially who has seen so much in Canada as an immigrant, as a woman of color, about the need for more stories showing the older generations of queerness that have been forcibly erased from history, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, that is absolutely true. And that is precisely why I intended Queer Coolie-tudes as an intergenerational film. The youngest person in the film is 20. The oldest person at the time of shooting the film, I believe, is 65, 67. So, and I'm somewhere in between. And many of us are somewhere in between. So, it was very a deliberate and conscious intention on my part. I've always intended it to be that way. In terms of, I think, unfortunately, our world tends to be very youth oriented, and at this point, we tend to discard wisdom, we tend to discard histories, we tend to discard really what elders bring to the table, because elders bring a lot. And I'm very interested in intergenerational communication and intergenerational work. I think that's a really good learning point and meeting point for particularly marginalized communities, or communities that don't often get enough voice, visibility, ability to speak, or even feel that they can speak. So that's why I asked how a Guyanese audience would find this film. I mean, if you don't like it, I'm fine. I'm not offended. I just, or if you don't connect to it, I'm fine too, because it's made for many different audiences. And if you find the film too academic, that's okay too. But I was just very curious, because I've not been able to, unfortunately, because of COVID, attend many screenings I was invited to. That's the reality. So because I've actually not attended a screening in the Caribbean at all, this would be one of the few platforms with this film. I was hoping to hear the perspective of Caribbean audiences.
Well, I can tell you though, I'm developing a syllabus in my department on 21st century political film for the next year. and Coolie-tudes is on the syllabus. And if and or when I get it developed and I have it in my class, I will let you know. And I might
Okay,
even
great.
invite you to that because like the work here is so very clearly politically resonant and engaged. And I do think that there is so much here, like you say, that in terms of sociology, psychology, cultural studies, it's happening here. So
Anthropology.
I'm
Yeah.
I'm being recorded right now. I'm promising you that I will follow up with
Okay,
you on that.
okay,
And we're
okay.
just wrapping up on time. So Michelle, if you just want to tell the audience where they can find you, where to look for your other work, what you have coming for us, just as a closing, we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, I am developing a new film slowly. Funding is always contingent. And I'm working on a book, and I'm located across universities. I teach at York University primarily. I also teach adjunct at University of Toronto, and I'm teaching, really happy to teach a film studies course after a while, contemporary Black American cinema. I love the course, I love teaching it at Wilfrid Laurier Film Studies. So I'm kind of all over the place. I don't like social media too much, but I'm on Facebook, so you can reach out to me there. If you want to ever get in touch with me personally, you can I suppose, message me on Facebook. Depends. Send a nice message. I'll respond at some point. Okay. But thanks to this film festival, to Mary Film Festival. I love the name. I love the insignia there. It's great. And thanks to Romola, and thanks to you. And I'm happy to be here today. So take care. Hope we can see each other in a post-pandemic world, if that's even possible.
Yes, thank you so much, Michelle, for your great words and for your film. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'll hand it back over to Romola to wrap us up for this segment.
Peace.
As soon as my camera comes on, here we go. Yes, all right. So we're still getting some messages in the chat.
Yes, if you could just read those, Michelle.
Yeah. Let me just pull. Here's one. I'm grateful that this is from Akila White. I'm just grateful I could see it at all. Here from Jamaica, not Indo-Caribbean, but filled with gratitude. Thank you, Akila.
Yeah,
And thank you, Michelle.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. I just wanted to say that. So thanks, Michelle, for allowing us to screen your film here, and for being, being present for this Q&A and for this conversation with us. And thanks, Andrew, for agreeing to do this. And hopefully we can work with you some more on some other things. And Michelle, as other opportunities come up for us to share this film, we will.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all very much, audience, festival organizers, Romola, Andrew, everyone. Thank you. I'm glad to be here today.
All right.